Hello, everybody. Welcome to BSides. I'm very sorry about the technical difficulties that we just had. Before we begin, I would just like to thank our platinum sponsors, St. Mary University and Island, for helping to make this event possible. We're also thankful for our support of Ataxion. I would like to turn over the microphone to Mr. Farley as he talks about Azure access and consequences.
Thank you.
About it.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me. So I wanted to talk about a topic that was very near and dear to me, because basically, as you guys have seen with supply chain attacks and passwords, attackers are on the move. And, basically, like, everyone has put MFA on their accounts, and that's great, right? Like, that leads to a whole separate side of attacks. But, the biggest thing that I have seen as, like, the cloud gets, like, sprawled out, gets large, it's multiple tenants, multiple organizations, right? Is attackers are on the move. All right. And so the biggest thing I want to talk about is I made a tool to highlight some of these problems, right? Because basically, like, attackers are already doing this. And so basically, like, they're not slamming passwords. They're not, they can. But the idea here is that now when you have your social engineering attacks, what they're doing is going to grab essentially your cloud tokens. That they bypass MFA. They bypass, like, they're already logged in. They usually have long access, and that's if it's on laptops, longer if it's actually, like, tied to service accounts, because no one wants to deal with the harsh reality that, like, that's how you get access. That's how you get reconnaissance. It's how you figure out, like, hey, like, what is the blast radius of, this infrastructure that I'm looking at? And the reality is that a lot of people, since it's so fractured, can't tell you otherwise, especially, like, it's basically if you give certain folks certain access. But basically, like, the other thing is, like, as they do this, they don't even have to do it on the laptop. They don't have to do it on the service. They can grab your credential through a social engineering, through a remote access tool, take it, run with it, and then at mass, do it large, right? Like, they basically, they can hammer the token out, and essentially recon your cloud infrastructure. They can find out where, if someone has, you say, like, viewer access, or, like, like Susie from accounting, right? They can figure out what access goes from there, start piecing things together, identify the next target, and just keep, repeating, and essentially just, before you know it, like, your huge sprawling cloud infrastructure, they know how to get in. They know the weak spots. And so, sorry. So, like, for example, like with, like, CI/CD in Azure, right? And so, what the tool that I've made, it's on GitHub. I will provide links, and there's also a lab for you guys to play with. The idea behind this is, if attackers are already doing this, that we as defenders need to start bringing this stuff up, in the sense that to chain this stuff together, to identify what exactly, hey, like, what does this user have access to? What can I do to escalate or identify a blast radius that's larger? Like, for example, if a CI/CD pipeline's hooked up to your, like, Kubernetes infrastructure, right? If you have those permissions to inject yourself into that pipeline, that could be problematic downstream, and you may not know who all has access, or even, be able to view those items. And so, but basically what this tool does is it will grab credentials off your machine using, like, environment variables, known folders, and essentially start mapping out where something could be modified, created, and identify, like, hey, like, here's where persistence, here's where exfiltration can happen, here's where, based on these permissions shown by stringing all these together, if you're not having these detections in place, like, they won't be visible, because a lot of these cloud services are meant to reach out to the world, the internet. Like, for example, so, like, on this one is for, like, your deployment path, right? And it highlights, for example, like, where certain pipelines are set up, and it identifies, like, hey, like, why this might be of value to a user if you don't know. And so as you kind of keep building, then you can start looking at stuff like, for example, like application services, it's stuff that already reached off the web hat, and then also has like execution ability, and for example, Azure, and it looks like regular service accounts. Like this isn't malware that's being ran. This isn't, I guess to me, like the way I think about it is it's not like your traditional desktop where, a file modification might look weird and get flagged by your AV. These are things that if like just through slight tweaks, can lead up to like, for example, like persistence, or again, like using stuff like, Event Hub to exfiltrate your data out, because Event Hub already kind of does that. It sends data out. And so like, for example, like for your app service, it checks, hey, by the way, like, do you have the capability using the current access that you have to, call these essentially these Azure APIs to set this up. And then, for the folks that don't know, it sets up like an operator walkthrough. That way you can identify exactly the steps based on the Azure APIs, how to set this up. That way, the idea here is that if this app can show you, attackers are already doing it. Like they've already pieced this together. They're doing this offline. Like they have all the time in the world. And by showing this, the idea here is it might be a little uncomfortable to highlight that, say like the leadership, right? But like if you can map this out clearly using credentials that are already issued, and say like those get compromised, like this is what the attacker sees. Like this is how they can identify, hey, how am I going to get back in, or how am I going to use surface accounts? That way, like I don't make it obvious that, like, for example, with a user credential, why am I slamming the Azure API for things that, hey, like you should already know? And so from there, again, cloud persistence, it doesn't look weird. Like your service accounts, they persist. Basically, I guess the way I think about it is like how many times have people rotated like service accounts in general, or set up a service that has access, say, for example, to all the database credentials, because, even if you segment off using containers, that something still has access to the database, right? And that's assuming that, you guys haven't taken mitigations in place to limit that blast radius. And so, again, with like Event Hub, highlighting again, like, hey, based on this current credentials, can I even get data out of here? Can I set up an Event Hub stream to pull this data from a separate endpoint and get it off your cloud? And then can I also do it to make sure like it doesn't seem like it's anything different than what's actually set up currently? And again, just highlighting exactly the steps that's needed to take. So that way, again, the idea is to make it very plain and forward. That way there's no ambiguity. There's no, like, hey, I think this can happen. It's like, hey, by the way, like, yes, I can call it. I can modify this Azure API. I can make this change currently as it stands. And so, basically they set it up, they can do this later. And so just trying to bring this to the forefront. So that way, if the attacker's already doing this, you can highlight that, say like your company's leadership and say like, hey, like, are we segmenting off like we're supposed to? Are we doing least privilege like we're supposed to? Because I know even from personal experience that like, I'd like to say, my IAM is set up appropriately. I can tell you from experience, usually that's not the case. And usually I can also tell you from experience that like, it's usually programmatic access that usually gets like, basically like people don't want to deal with the inconvenience that like, if I set up a service account, it works. And it's like, well, that's great. Do you have detections in place? Do you have an idea of like, hey, when this differs from the norm, do you get alerts for it? Do you even know what a difference even looks like if someone makes a slight tweak and the API changes? Because most of this tool pools don't hit the data plane. They hit purely the control plane, and that's already noisy as it is. Because the data plane's noisier. And so the idea here is like, you've got to look for these. Like, they basically like, I can tell you from experience that like, if you were to ask folks, even on your own security team, they don't know where all the data is going. I've had experience with work before where, you would have unauthenticated endpoints talking to each other, and they just assume that because the IP hasn't changed, that was okay. And no one questioned it. There was no alerts. There was no auditing, right? It's basically like this was accepted. This was business. And this is the kind of highlight, hey, this could be problematic because if that's unauthenticated, I can do all of this with it. I can grab the data on the other end. And it was purely for business. It worked. It worked great on the, on the receiving end of the business that was working on it. And no one thought different. But like, if you take those assumptions and now take it for an attacker, do you have the logging, the capability in place to actually detect, hey, whoever's on the receiving end, is that who I think it is? So I guess I spoke a little fast, but, I set up a lab. So, I didn't put links. I apologize. But no, there's a lab on the GitHub. I can provide links if you guys want to reach afterwards. But basically the idea is it's a Terraform script that will set up a intentionally insecure Azure environment. So that way, if you want to test it through, the idea is for defenders, right? Since attackers are already piecing this together, the idea here is use it. Identify, for example, the logs that you get generated, right? Look at the logs, make detections, right? Like figure out like, hey, like, if I see, X, Y, and Z that happens, in sequence, maybe that's bad. Do we even know, hey, what does that sequence look like? When, for example, like, these are some of the examples, but like some of the other ones, especially with the newer technology, like for example, like AI and machine learning, the way I joke about it at work is it's my favorite is, do you know why Python's running from a non-standard path, right? And for a lot of your AI notebooks, they have to run Jupyter Python. And so you have the execution capability. It can have a service account that has execution into the environment, and you can ship data out of your cloud. And it's necessary. It's needed. Do you guys have detections in place? And so again, like that's also in the tool, right? To highlight those things, because again, like that's always my favorite, right? Is I've handled multiple incidents where it's like, hey, like, why is this tool running Python? We don't even run Python here, right? And a lot of people can't explain to you like the extra packages. People can't explain to you like why is this reaching out to the internet? But like, hey, I know a lot of companies that are also rushing to get AI stuff out there, and it's like, hey, like maybe we don't have detections in place because velocity, right? And so, yeah, I so fast. Yes.
What code is it? What's it written?
Go.
Oh, well, you just answered 10 my question.
Hopefully in a good way.
I was worried you were going to say PowerShell because there's tons of other tools that are PowerShell, and then you can run PowerShell on Linux, but then not all the APIs are exposed to it.
No, so how did you? I mean, did you manually go through and all the APIs? I mean, just reference them and go.
A lot of SDK work. There's about this is a big undertaking. So each command has about 7 steps to make sure, like, for example, it's tested through and through, right? There's about 2,000 documents outlining basically what good looks like, where, like, for example, like, where, like, data boundaries have to be, called out, right? Cause like, for example, like, you can't account for everything, right? And I say that in the sense of like, hey, if you guys find issues, like, please let me know. I will spin the Azure bill and hammer it out for an update, right? Cause like, sure, right? But no, the idea was basically make it all prepackaged, make it all nice and cross OS compatible. That way, like, the idea was that what I had with the idea for the tool was basically the ability to drop in, grab a credential, see what you can have. And if you were going to do this from a black box perspective, you can. If you were just curious, you also can, right? But basically, like, just find what's in your environment. What can you grab?
So since we have time, Stubbs is other tools that will scan for best practices and garbage like that.
So how does your tool? So you give it a credential somehow or whatever, it goes. is as it's going, I mean, are you like, what is there logic involved? Oh, now I've got a credential. I'm going to try these 50 things. What does it do if it finds a success on one of the 50 bands?
So to be clear,
Right.
this is not an exploit tool. This is purely,
Why not?
This started off as something that, so like, for example, your PowerShell example, it also wasn't a terrible idea. I also thought about it because I also thought about executing the Go binary to PowerShell because you could do it, right? But no, they basically like, to me, it's like, I didn't want to make an exploit tool. What I got really tired of was the green, yellow, red system. Like, for example, when you do vulnerability scanning, right? And everyone sees everything's critical, right? And like, if you don't have like tagging, data classification, right? You're just like, cool. So like everything's red. This is amazing. Thank you. Right. And so this is more to make like a pointed example, essentially, right? Of highlighting, for example, like the walkthroughs in the tool, right? Find like the best with the current permissions that it can.
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
Okay.
How does it do this?
So it maps out basically for like from your current credential, what do you have access to? And then it also like tries to identify for like through certain, like if you have like the ability to impersonate service accounts, whatnot, if you can like privilege escalation. So not only are there like walkthroughs, the walkthroughs were the way to make it easy. There's about, so that 2,000 documents we're talking about, there's like 50 helper commands that basically just kind of piece that all together if you want to kind of nitpick.
Right.
The walkthrough is basically adjust those to make it like just an easier way to understand. But basically, like you can go through and say like, hey, like what access do I have using this account to like privilege escalate, and go through that route. And so basically,
It will go that second step and go and analyze it. Be like, oh, wait, you're allowed to migrate to the system account.
Yes.
And it tells you, does it give you which service? I mean, does it give you the raw data so that I can put it into a pen test?
oh yeah. It also saves it as JSON. For that format, it saves it a tabular output in case you want fancy, text output. Basically anything that you need to like ingest this data in key value format, right? Or just again, to show the leadership, like, hey, like here's a pretty table. Here's how screwed we are.
So in your example of migrating to like an elevated system or something like that, so it does not then,
Can you make it then go ahead and do that attack and then restart over again? Or is that?
No, it just highlights that you can. So you'd actually have to invoke the Azure API to actually do that. But basically, since it uses the Azure SDK and APIs, it essentially checks against the permission schema to actually make sure it can do it. So the idea is that kind of like the unspoken part is like, hey, by the way, if I could check this and have the capability to assume this, more than likely, if you're also at this box, you can execute.
From a pen testing standpoint, it's still very useful because it flags that, tells you what to do. And it's like, oh, hey, I just will do that. Yeah. But I was just curious, how far away?
No, I feel like past work for future work. If I did that, they'd be upset. So this was more of a way to empower just most folks, right? But also kind of hint at, hey, by the way, right? Like that capability table at the beginning is basically just pulling like the pure Azure APIs that's needed to do it, and have that quick yes no, right? Let you know, hey, like is this walkthrough even worth it, right? Because basically, if it's all no, you're like, okay, cool, like move on, right? And so it tries to make sure it's backed by that, so that way, like like, hey, by the way, like we're not crazy, right? Like yeah, we're seeing this. Okay, cool. So I do have access, and I have ownership, or I have contributor level. You know what I'm saying? Just something where like I can get access to these machines, these services, configure them, because sometimes you may not have create ability, but you might have modification ability, right? And that's also important. And a slew of other things, like for example, like turning telemetry off, turning it on, right? Hiding behind certain cloud activities. And then also been trying to do quite a bit of performance improvement in the sense of, for example, instead of blasting the Azure API, I try to do like, for example, like bounded calls. So that way, like the fan out doesn't look insane, because as you do some of these walkthroughs, you are touching a lot of services. But the idea is to provide both, right? In the sense of like, for example, if you're just like, hey, no, like I know this is noisy as all get out. Like I'm not going to touch AKS. I'm not going to touch, our pipeline, right? But I know, hey, this is there. You can ping, like the DevOps specific, right? And like kind of piece together, hey, I just need this, right? And then I don't need the rest because, hey, I know what I'm doing afterwards. And so I try to give the best of both worlds because no, like if you slam the Azure API, like, yeah, like you can, but the biggest thing is also like the lab also generates like timestamps of like, for example, when you run certain commands, that way you can at least try to correlate it with like the logs that show up in Azure. So that way at least you can start seeing like, hey, like here's where this started. Because, I can tell you like from places that I worked at and
The magic word there is a metrics.
Yeah.
When you start it, like, oh, like call it 60% of it. And then the next week, then your metric says, oh, now we're logging 70% of it.
Yeah.
And the manager goes, oh my gosh.
yeah, or that or like, it's super broad and all of a sudden now your detections alerts are going towards like verifying admin activity. And you're like, no, like Steve does this like every week. Like I need to know when Steve doesn't do what he does every week, right? Like that's the problem, right? And so like trying to at least try to hit that middle ground for teams and companies. So that way, like you don't go all the way and annoy Steve every week because I've been there and we've become best friends with Steve and Steve's like, I deal with Kubernetes like every day, man, right? He's like, I have to do something, right? But at least try to like have some sort of shaping around like detections and Azure that you're like, hey, like this just doesn't make sense, right? Like why are we modifying Python to send data out, right? And, using those like Azure, like notebooks to do that, right? Like beyond like what's already established, right? If you're like, hey, like we don't control this IP, no one's reported it, like no one owns this and now it touches our AI infrastructure, you're like, well, that's probably bad. You should at least look into that and at least be like, oh, okay, cool. Thank you for next time. Can we get a ticket in? At least, like this is ours, or at least set up some sort of like, make sure we know where our data is leaving and, receiving. Because a lot of companies don't. They just either set it up or again, like if they didn't set it up, well, they have further problems, right? Because who was setting it up?
You ever look at AWS?
So it's on my to-do list.
Oh, yeah.
Getting there. So it is a plan. I originally got inspired by Cloud Fox, by Bishop Fox, because I liked how they like name stuff, and so that's why I did Azure, because it originally kind of spun out. I was like, well, I want to help contribute back, right? So I think this is a great idea. And then I got in my own mind and further down and was like, well, I'm just going to start just pointing out everything to everyone. And then kind of from there, kind of like different to the point where it's like, I can't fork this back, right? Because basically like it doesn't fit their permission schema. So the plan is, yes, right? It might take a bit because I did make the mistake of like, I want to do Kubernetes next, which is, its own beast. It's phenomenal. Basically it comes down to even on that one, like for like managed Kubernetes, it like tries to set up where like flags it where it's like, hey, you see certain things for like let you know, like, hey, this is managed Kubernetes. And it's like, hey, by the way, like you might as well just go and look for these. Cause like if anyone messes these things up, you're already in, right? But no, that's the plan. But that's why that decision was kind of made there, right? It's because basically was trying to cover down and try to at least help contribute back to the security community, at least how I felt I could. Yeah.
Sorry, we have time. So
Yeah.
I'll just keep asking.
You see, we're about 10 minutes.
There you go. So one of your first few examples of the things you were talking about, and I've already forgotten exactly what the examples were, but you gave a bunch of examples of like your Python example. It's like it's a thing that you have access to, but it's an illogical. I mean, maybe for some companies, it's a logical thing that they do all the time. So does your tool have does it specifically look for? Oh, I've got Jupyter access, and then does it go beyond just seeing if you have access or, and then like, are there like 10 like hard coded solutions that I've never heard of or like 10 API? Is there like your special key put into the tool? So I can just
Blank you if it doesn't work.
I mean, you can blame me regardless because, I think it should capture as much as we can. The issue with the notebooks is and it gets kind of weird, right? In the sense of for execution capability, you usually have to pull the metadata because basically like, the notebook, I believe, runs as a container, right? And then basically it executes in the container, right? And so you have to kind of pull that metadata to check against the permissions and like it does kind of disclose like environment available secrets. And so yes, but no. So like in the sense of like basically it will go as far as to detect like, hey, I do believe you have, the ability to change this metadata, right? But it probably won't let you know exactly what's in there. But at that point, if you can change what's inside, then the script, currently that's running doesn't matter.
Did you hard code other like ideas that I had never thought of besides, I mean, Jupyter, firing up one of those, one example, did you go through like every single type of API call that you could do and then like thoughtful about like, is it, essentially, obviously there's a tons of tools that tell you yes, no. Yes, you have access to this. Who gives a crap? What's the impact of that? That doesn't mean anything. So your tool is telling people, oh, you have access to this, and then that can lead to that. And that's great.
Yeah.
Because you could use that in a pen test report or as motivation to do the next thing. But, I guess, how deep did you go into all the other APIs?
So,
Brag a little bit.
yes, not fully, right? So what I've been trying to do, what I mean by not fully is like, been trying to do slices, right? In the sense of like, for example, like the persistence exfiltration, try to highlight that for like 1.3, right? With further planned stages. How much time do we have?
Looks like you got about 7 minutes until I was going to cut you off for questions. So you got about 13 minutes left.
All right. I could so like that command library that I've been working on so hard, it's public on GitHub. Like not like, no, sorry, like the command library is not, right? So like, that's like boring stuff, but if people want that, I can, right? But basically like, we've got 13 minutes. I don't mind showing you the folder structure. And you go, hey, click here. Tell me more. Because basically so when I say 373, that's all helper commands, right? These aren't all fully implemented yet, because these are all just like rough ideas. Like, hey, can we prove these, right? But basically try to walk the entire MITRE attack framework, because you're like, hey, like if there's a will, there's a way. If we just got to find a way to do it truthfully.
I think your exfil example is something that I would, as a person who does this, if you could give me one recommendation of, you could exfil with this, and that would be something that like, it might flag something that never occurred to me. Like, it never occurred to me that you can exfil by, creating a bucket. And I mean, that's a stupid example.
Well, no, here, I'm going to take the HTML for I don't show like all mine. Like, not like, I will show the files. I just going through documents and stuff. And you're like, tax returns. That's neat, right? I was like, all right.
Are you Emily? Yeah, I'm also doing the next presentation, the HarrierOps Azure.
Hello, guys. No. Okay. Am I allowed to start saying I'm about to use, huh? Or
So early.
can't rush you outside.
Did I mess it up?
There it is. Have you tried?
The inspired, if you, can I get it to show it? See. Always messing things up. No, it's okay. This one I'm not allowed to test the cloud. They're like, they'll get him a password. He's going to ruin everything.